Michael came to me when he was working on his master's project, and he had one request. He said, help me learn about 911.
Welcome back, everybody, to Safety Cap Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cassidy. I'm here with Karin today. Karin, how you doing?
Happy Monday. Doing good. Fighting a little bit of a cold, but my voice lasted through the weekend, so
We are recording on a Monday, which is rare for us. So we're going to, see how this goes today. And we want to welcome our guest, Laurie Flaherty. Laurie, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're somewhat of a legend in this space of 911, so we're honored to have you on the show. And we would love to get into a conversation on kind of your journey in your career on champion 911 and in various causes, specifically at the federal level, but not just inclusive to that. What we love to do when we start these discussions is kind of get your origin story or background of just how you got into this space and kind of, this became a mission for you, and would love to hear that story.
First of all, there was no plan. So, I don't want to, and I want to just anybody have the need to have a plan, because there was no plan. I mean, in fact, I was an emergency nurse for 25 years. And when I reached a certain age, I literally decided it was time to go sit down. And that's when I took a job with the Office of Emergency Medical Services, which is within the federal government. And while I was working there, Congress passed the law that made that office responsible for the 911 program. And they didn't give us any money to hire 911 people, so we had to turn somebody into a 911 person. And so my boss came to me and said, how'd you like to do something completely different? And I said, okay. And at that point, and I've said this many times, I knew how to dial 911. That's all. But it was a very different space back then. And what that really afforded me the opportunity to do was lean on the 911 community and find out from them what needed to happen, and find out from them what I needed to learn. So I did that for about 20 years and retired from federal service at the end of 2021.
It doesn't feel like it's been that long already, Laurie. It feels like it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's been 3.5 years.
How in the early days do you go about doing that? I have to believe that's a kind of a daunting task. You join in one capacity, and then your boss comes and says, hey, how would you like to learn this entirely new thing? And what was the thought process? Like, how do you start that? Like, I'm sure it's like, oh, I need to go talk to people in this space, but like, how do you figure out who to even go talk to?
Yeah, it was, even in the federal realm, it was a very different world at that point. For example, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau at the FCC hadn't been formed yet. And so even within the FCC, I had to talk to like 6 different parts of it to make sure I got it covered until they were all combined. DHS had just been formed. And so like that they were still in the process of organizing themselves. And they're literally, there still is, frankly, a dearth of 911 expertise within the federal government, but there was like none back then. There were a lot of people that knew about emergency communications, but it was the push to talk world, it was the LMR world. So it wasn't hard to be a pioneer, because there was very little going on at that point. And I just, went to the 911 community. And at that point, we were still at E911. Like, there was no NG911 at that point. And so it provided the federal government the opportunity to be sort of the convener, the Switzerland, if you will, among all the different companies and all the different associations that had anything to do with 911. And so that's really the role that I came to play, was sort of that convener. Okay, what do you guys think needs to happen? How do I help you make that a reality? Just to give you one example, we actually built and tested the first NG911 prototype to see if NG911 would actually work. And that was back in 2004. And I really think that project helped move NG911 from concept to reality. So it was that kind of thing. It was what needs to happen to move this forward and then figuring out the way to make it happen.
It's easy to be a pioneer because there was nobody there to do the job, when that's actually the difficulty. So hats off. I mean, I guess you're a real pioneer when you're like, yeah, that was pretty simple because, there's no alternative. So amazing. How would you characterize where we were when you started versus where we are today in 911?
I think there is a clearer picture of what it will take to get there than there was when I first started. I think there were a lot of people with ideas, but I don't know that there was a lot of consensus around those ideas. As much as the 911 system in this country is a patchwork, we want it to be the same experience for the caller, no matter where the caller is. But that means there has to be a level of standardization, which sort of begs for somebody to figure out what that is, whether it's data or interconnection or training or whatever it is, just sort of helping people decide together what that means. I think has kind of moved things along, just to pull everybody together to decide for themselves sort of how to move it forward.
And if you were to take the thought of where do we want the future state, and maybe spend a few minutes on what is it we're trying to move everybody to, and then how would you compare that to where we are in the journey? So if NG911 is the future state, kind of, if you wouldn't mind, for folks who may not be as familiar with that, what does that future state kind of look like?
When I take apart NG911, it's two things. It's, I think people think about it in terms of data, you and I can send photos and video to each other, but when we first started this concept, the 911 centers were not able to receive that information because they didn't have the infrastructure to do that. So it's the data, but I think one of the things that I learned from the 911 community is that probably even more important to them than that is the interconnection. The 911 centers, even within a state, were not connected to each other when we started down this road. And so if you think about any of the disasters we've had just within the last few months, and, the 911 centers that were taken out of operation or that were completely overloaded, there was no way to share that load. Those, I remember using Katrina as an example in the beginning because I forget how many, 911 centers were taken out of commission, but those calls went nowhere. And so the difference now is that with the interconnection and sort of, hopefully some standardization of the data, those people can get help where they were not able to before. So that to me, that's what it comes down to.
And from a standpoint of that interconnectedness, how far along are we? Is it, we feel like we've got that solved? Do we think we're halfway there? How would you characterize that when you look around the country?
It's a patchwork. When I was with the 911 program, we did collect data from the states on how much progress they had made in terms of implementing next generation 911. I believe the program has lost the legal authority to do that, but that data was really helpful to a lot of people just in terms of understanding rural versus urban and the haves and the have-nots, because that clearly still exists.
Yeah, I was just looking at a comment on social media the other day, reflective of that sentiment, where this person was rightfully so frustrated because communities that have money seem to have more advanced 911 systems versus maybe communities or rural areas of the country that don't. And so how did you think about that at the federal level in terms of solving that? Or where do you think the government is, not to put you on the spot, but like, where do you think we are today from a federal perspective in terms of trying to solve that? Or would you characterize that as not an issue? But it seemed like this individual was saying, listen, this is an issue where
I think it comes down to two things. It comes down to a legal authority and money. To be really blunt, the authority to do that is different from one state to another. Like, especially the home rule states, they have very limited ability to pull that off. While in the 20 years I managed the 911 program, there was grant funding twice that we had to, figure out how to disperse equitably among all the states. And that gave them the opportunity to figure out where they needed it the most and where to put that money. It's sort of, to me, it's sort of a no-brainer. I mean, the technology exists. We know it does. Because AT&T and Verizon, companies like that have invested literally billions of dollars in their networks to make sure that their networks are able to do those things. The 911 system is publicly funded, and we simply have not made the same investment. We invested $7 billion in the LMR world, but we haven't made a similar investment in 911. That's what it comes down to.
it's interesting. And maybe I'd love your thoughts on this, but when I talk to folks who aren't familiar with the 911 world, other than just calling 911, like you mentioned when we all first got into the space, and I explain how decentralized it is, and there's 6,000 different local agencies kind of making their own decisions, or made them by states or by county. I just kind of get this look of like, what? Like, I think the general public may not be necessarily aware of that, and the reaction is usually like, why don't we just go fix this? I'm curious, like, do you get the same reaction when you're talking to folks outside of 911, where they're kind of like, I don't understand why we would ever design a system like this, or was it just me?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I ran into a lot was, it works. What's the problem? Somehow we've duct taped and like Velcroed this system together, and God love the people that answer those calls, because they make it work. And in fact, it's like 220 million times a year people call that number, and it works so well that the only time you hear about it is when it doesn't work. And when you think about how rarely you hear those stories, that's how reliable the system has become. So then the question is just like, well, then, like, what's the problem? It works. And it's, unless you have been on the end of one of those calls one way or the other, or you have spent time in a 911 center, you don't get that. You don't get that.
That's a fabulous point. It's so true. You're right. Like, when you dial it, it works. Obviously, thanks to the people on the other line, not necessarily the technology or the government funding it. Interesting. Karin, what's your thoughts on this? How would you characterize this? You've had to live this as a practitioner and in this space as well.
I think the professionals in 911 are amazing figure it outers. And to Laurie's point, like, it does work, because if there is a time where there's a hiccup or you're not sure what to do, you figure it out, because that, behind the seat and answering those calls, you have no other choice. And so if you have challenges with your lines not ringing into your 911 center on the 911 lines, you're going to find an alternative route to get them into your 10-digit lines. And if that doesn't work, you find a tertiary route. And so because we've become so good at figuring things out, it has felt like there's not enough attention in the funding piece. And, if we go back and think about not just the last few months, but over several years, our emergencies, especially natural disasters and those more domestic type of incidents, are really relying on this system to be up, running, and working wherever you are calling from, even as you are calling from maybe a body of water and being swept away. Their natural disasters are no respecter of jurisdictional boundaries. And they don't care if the 911 system is, upgraded and has an EZNet here and over here it doesn't. So we can't extend that call. And so I think it's beyond time. And we've been talking about this piece for 20 some years. It's beyond time for the government to step up and step forward to finally appropriately fund the most critical system that is used by everyone in our communities each and every day. And it's great that it still works and it can be better. And it's great that people are answering the calls and we can still get better training. And it's great that they're still there dealing with all of the horrific incidents, but they still need mental health and wellness, information and resources. So if it's good, great. We can still always do better.
As you kind of look into the future, what would be, I'm going to put you on the spot, by the way, what would be the top 3 things that the government could do to like if you could wave your wand, what would you want to have happen in terms of improving kind of the national infrastructure for 911?
Well, I think it goes back to a couple of things that I said before, that, particularly since 911 is such a hodgepodge of state and local systems. Like whatever the federal government can do to standardize, to bring the community together to figure out sort of whether it's data or interconnection or whatever it is, training, it would be really helpful to have some kind of standardization. And we touched a little bit on that when I was with the program. We came up with minimum training standards that have been adopted by a number of states. There's always the funding piece, and that's tough. I mean, the recent efforts in terms of timing have really borne that out, just in terms of, the possibility or the likelihood of, Congress appropriating the kind of money that it will take to do that. I think the states have shown a remarkable sort of, they're really good at coming up with ideas for how to manage that and make things happen. And the state directors are one of the most giving groups of people that I've ever worked with in terms of just sharing their, whatever it is, sharing their documents, sharing their examples, sharing their people with each other to sort of, float all boats. So I think it's going to be a combination of things.
On one hand, it may feel like a lot of money to do this, but on the other hand, if you look at what our government spends, we're not talking a ton of money at a macro level to make a difference here. I mean, as a citizen that looks at what else the government spends money on, I'm like, this shouldn't be that hard of a decision. Anyway, I digress.
It might also be just sort of helping, people in Congress aren't going to fund things that they don't understand. Just to give you, an example, the 911 Wonder Women is an organization that I volunteer some time with, and we're really encouraging folks to do what we're calling a tour and tell. Like, okay, the August recess is coming up. All the members of Congress are going home to their districts. Wouldn't it be a great time to invite them to, or have them invite themselves to your 911 center and actually spend some time there? Because to me, that's really the best way for people to understand it and to decide to back it.
I love that idea. We talk about this quite a bit. We do a lot of work with, enterprises who want to understand 911 better and connect with them. There's no better way to do that than take them into a 911 center. And I think there's kind of life before you've been in the center, and there's life and thoughts after you've been in the center. And there's not one person who hasn't come out of a visit.
Especially if you spend time actually listening to somebody taking those calls.
It just changes your perspective completely once you see it.
We have an opportunity in our 911 centers, and I think it's getting so much better, but to tell our own story. So whether that's your communication center having its own social media page, so you can share with your community members all of the great things that are happening, how people are delivering babies, how and when to appropriately call 911. So public education and celebrating, but also we have to take that internally and start leveraging the folks internal. So are you briefing your chiefs on the successes and wins that you have? Is that going to city council and mayors and your sheriff's office? And then how do we then elevate that message to those representatives within our state outside of the times that we're at 911 goes to Washington, where we have very little time to sit with our representatives and their staffers to share the good word. And I love, like I see here locally, there's one who has their mayor come in and do sit-alongs quite frequently, and he shares about it on his social media feeds. And so getting that real level understanding of, like, the other day we were doing another recording and we were talking about the people in your neighborhood. Well, it's the people that you see, but it's also the people that are unseen, right? So you might see the patrol cars driving by, pulling over a car or responding to an emergency. And you might see the fire trucks and the ambulance. How did they get there? They got there because somebody initiated a request into that organization, and that's answered by a 911 professional and dispatched by a dispatcher, a 911 professional. And that's how, you start connecting with those people that are behind the scenes. So I like to tell people to get curious and go meet them, have open houses and invite your community in, because they're going to be your strong advocates as well as they're thinking about maybe where they want to put their monies too.
Well, and I think that's a great point. Trying to get law enforcement, fire to advocate for you. They are very powerful politically. Whether it's local, state, or national, they are very so bringing those people in and convincing them to become advocates for 911 may be a really, really powerful thing to do.
Yeah, you actually answered partially something I was going to ask you both about, and that is, Laurie, you mentioned back when you first started in the government, there wasn't a lot of 911 representatives or voices, and I assume maybe that's still the case. As a nurse, people understand what nursing is, and I think people understand what law enforcement is and fire departments. Where are we in terms of like people's understanding of like the 911 profession and kind of what are some other things to do to kind of elevate that? You mentioned one by obviously working through law enforcement. Any other thoughts on like how do we continue elevating that, or how would you characterize where we are with that today?
I think one of the things is the whole reclassification issue, and my perspective on that was really influenced by my federal experience. Back in 2018, when the last time that the SOC, the occupational classification system was revised, I went to them because there was this big uproar about telecommunicators being classified as clerical. And I said, help me understand why that is the case. The truth of it is that agency, they operate a database. And so they collect data from all the thousands of occupations. And based on that, they classify them. So it's not like some invisible federal agency is making that decision. They get the data from us. And so, part of me doesn't understand because I asked them, so what happens if a law's passed? They're like, we don't know. Cause what do we say then? Do we say, okay, for all these thousands of occupations, here's the data. For 911, well, we don't have the data, but they made us. So in my head, especially coming from nursing, which is one of the other occupations that had to provide the data to be classified the way it is, we're not any different. To me, it's up to us to make sure that our job descriptions and all those things are up to date, because that's where the classification comes from. It comes from us. And, even in the last couple of years, Now Wonder Woman has done webinars on this, and we pulled job descriptions from websites, from 911 centers, within the last 2 years that explain the job as being clerical. What do you want? You know what I mean? I always end that presentation with Glenda of the North. It's just you've always had the power yourself, my dear. I mean, it's up to us to make that happen.
I totally agree. And, over the last several years, I have uncovered a new layer that maybe I wasn't as aware of as I knew before, right? And I have so much appreciation now for diving a little bit deeper into those job descriptions. So I'm gonna plead to the folks out in the communities, use AI also to do a comparison of other roles that are not clerical that show the work that you do, and also build out job descriptions to show where 911 or where our profession is going to be in the next couple of years, because we have to also have that future state in mind so that we can be seen in the reclassification efforts to be appropriately classified. And it's the tasks, the other assignments as or other duties as assigned that we don't always document that we're doing in those centers. So it's how we're leveraging the databases to make life critical decisions, how we're negotiating with suspects on the phone who may be threatening to harm themselves or harm others, negotiating barricaded people, and, helping our law enforcement and our fire and EMS communities to make a positive impact without the community, having additional issues or anybody else getting hurt. So really going in and deep diving into that documentation versus our job descriptions no longer should be answer the call, dispatch the call, answer the call, dispatch the call. We are leveraging databases and tools. We're watching videos. We're communicating with folks in other languages in new ways. Like, there is so much more that we're doing that we just have not had the time to sit down and really express what the job is and where do we see it going in the future. So we got to take the time.
Why does that still happen though? Because it sounds like, I hear what you say, Karin, and I think there's a whole movement logically, like that is the job today. But then, Laurie, your point's very valid. You're trying to make this case, and somebody goes and says, well, I can just pull up these job descriptions, and it says right here, it's clerical work.
Well, I think updating job descriptions is a really tedious, time-consuming thing. And depending on, how your 911 system is set up and who you report to, it can be very complicated and really, painful to go through. So I think there's that, and but certainly the job has evolved way beyond a lot of the descriptions that are out there. I mean, and one of the things that someone else said is, well, why are we surprised when people come into this profession and then leave because it's not what they expected? Well, if they're looking at the job description and what they're doing doesn't match, well, of course they're overwhelmed. Of course they're going to leave after a short period of time because it's not what the job they applied for, But I think it's a tedious, time-consuming, painful process. But I think it's ultimately worth it. Like a lot of other painful, tedious processes.
You brought up a really good point, Laurie, that I didn't think about at first, is depending on who you report to. So if you're, having to go through your HR department and your law enforcement partner, or if you're managed and governed by fire or a board, does this impact a union? And does that have to be looked at again and renegotiated? Is there an assumption that this is going to increase salary? And so then, sometimes that may be where you get declined on making the appropriate changes. So there's a battle still to fight here, but we can't give up.
So, Laurie, we talked a little bit about the federal government. We've talked about what 911 can do. We have associations like the one you're involved with, 911 Wonder Woman, NINA, APCO, folks like that. What about the vendors? What about us, like the RapidSOS of the world and folks like us? What, from your perspective, what's our role to play, and what could we be doing better to help, move us to a standard and make sure we get the visibility and support for 911?
Well, I think a couple things. I think, the company that you folks work for is really good at collecting stories. And those stories are really useful, as we said before, in terms of helping other people really understand what 911 is about, how it works, why it's important, through stories. What happens when it works well, what happens when it doesn't work very well. So I think that's one thing. And to the extent that you have data, that's really helpful too, because you can quantify the problems, you can quantify the successes, you can quantify the difference between 5 years ago and now. You can that's one of the things that about data that while it's not nationally uniform data, without knowing what your customer base is sort of the numerator. We without knowing what the denominator is, we don't have the full picture, but we have a picture that is really useful to talk about in terms of all the things that I just mentioned. So I think the stories and the data, and groups like the NG 911 Institute, which again is sort of a Switzerland, if you will. And I know that there are private companies that are members of that organization, and their role is to educate members of Congress. So getting involved in organizations like that, I think all those things are important.
So as you mentioned you wrapped up a few years ago, kind of being the coordinator for the 911 program, federal level. I'm just curious, like, how do you spend your time now in terms of like keeping the good fight going? If you don't mind me asking.
So we were talking before we started the recording. So my main criteria right now for whether I take something on or not is that going to be fun? Because if it's not going to be fun, I've said no. I mean, I just did a phone call with somebody a couple months ago, and they started the conversation by saying, "We'd like you to be in charge of," and I was like, "Just stop right there. Just stop right there, because I am not going to be in charge of anything ever again. If you find somebody else to be in charge of it, I will help." But so that's really my main criteria, and it's something. It would be something that would keep me in touch with the people, because I think the people are why I lasted so long in that job, and they were the high point. And if you're talking about the most difficult part of it, it was also the people. So I think it's all of that.
You're at a good spot in your life when you can say my criteria for what I do is, am I going to have fun or not? So congratulations on that. I hope to be at that point someday in my life. I don't know if I'm going to get there.
I'm going to say, Cassidy, our conversations are going to change here soon.
Yeah, really. I don't know,
You've
man.
just given Karin too many ideas.
I earned it,
Yes.
I took my first job like 50 years ago, and so I earned it. But it's a nice place to be.
Yeah, so that's a great way to frame it. You mentioned, our talk before the talk. So we're going to put you on the spot. You mentioned the first time you met Michael Martin, our founder and CEO. I'd love you to kind of share that story and kind of your impression of Michael from the early days till today.
Sure. So in my role at the 911 program, I had people come to me all the time who, had just developed the latest, whiz bang app, that was going to change the 911 world. I would always ask them the same two questions. I would say, okay, well, how does this work with the existing 911 infrastructure? And they wouldn't know, because they were interested in circumventing it. They weren't interested in figuring that out. And then I would say, okay, these people don't have a lot of money. Like, have you done any, have you measured how much better it makes 911 than it is now? Because without that, it's going to be hard for them to invest. And they usually didn't have an answer for that either. Michael came to me when he was working on his master's project, and he had one request. He said, "Help me learn about 911. Like, send me to the right people. Where should I go? What should I do?" He was literally like the only one, like out of all of the people that came to me. And that's why I remembered it, because I was so impressed by this guy who wasn't in it to, make a buck, or wasn't in it to, further his great idea. He wanted to he wanted to devote his energy in the right direction. He's a very special guy. You guys are lucky to have him.
We are. I love that story because you hear it over and over again in all the people that met Michael in the early days. And it's just the consistent authenticity of Michael and really wanting to learn and understand the problem. And that's been cultivated across our whole organization is, learning to understand and solve the real world problems for these people who are, they are tapped on their funding. They don't have a lot of money to spend. What can we do to really make a true impact and help these telecommunicators go home at the end of the day, knowing, not wondering or questioning, that they were able to make an impact today and every day?
I appreciate you sharing that, Laurie, and echo what Karin said too. It's it's the fabric of the company and how everybody shows up. And Michael still is out there learning and talking to 911, feels like every day. So I sometimes like to ask, what should I have asked in terms of this conversation that I didn't ask? Is there something that we should be discussing around this topic that we didn't bring up?
For up and coming telecommunicators, one of the things that I sort of like to emphasize is, you were talking about 911 associations before, and getting actively involved in those. And while most people view that as giving, free time, their time freely, what I usually counter with is, yes, it is, but it is free training. It is free training for things that your 911 center probably does not have the bandwidth to provide to you. And I'm a good example of that. Like, when I was an emergency nurse, I became actively involved in the Emergency Nurses Association. And it was through that organization that I learned how to write. I learned how to do public presentations. I learned how to manage a project. I learned how to, manage a group of people. And those skills are not specific to any one profession. You can take those, living proof, right? Like I know how to dial 911 and that's all. But I had this toolkit that I then applied. It was just a matter of like, okay, how do I apply this to something new? And telecommunicators can do that if they avail themselves of the opportunities that national organizations provide them. It's not just providing your time for free. It's free training. It's free training that your 911 center probably can't give you. And the networking that those organizations can provide is worth, 10 times that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to frame it too, around the training and the education, the networking. I assume there's a mental health aspect of this too. I think we all in our professions, it's tough to empathize with folks if you're not in the profession. So I think a lot of professions have these communities that they work with, and the more you're involved with these communities, they tend to be the better off you are in that profession. So I appreciate everything that you're doing around that. So thank you. For those who want to learn more from you and have something fun that they want to propose to you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
I don't know. I mean, probably, you guys have my email.
That's the key right there. If you don't know Laurie, you're not going to get a hold of her. So you have to be on the inner circle. So I love that. If you think you have something fun out there for Laurie, you have to go through Karin. So there we go.
I think I could be easily found.
Sounds like a plan to me.
Well, Laurie, I appreciate the time. This has been obviously very educational for myself. It's wonderful meeting you. Thank you for your service and everything that you've done as well. So obviously the 911 community has been better for it, and look forward to partnering with you going forward and having some fun.
Thanks so much for your time. It was fun talking to both of you.